to another Social Studies virtual professional development. Today's focus is planning, so we'll dig into Unit 1 to give you a sense of how to plan in the Social Studies classroom.
Hi, my name is Paula Rowe. I teach at C. Bird High School. I am the department chair for social studies as well as the AP US History, AP US Government and Politics teacher. I've been teaching for 14 and a half years at the school and have been in social studies and testing areas the entire time. I also have moved into working with the content team and AP reading and in that community.
Hey, my name is Sarah Williams. I've been teaching for 17 years now in Caddo Parish. I'm a master teacher. I support English as well as history. Currently, I'm housed at Caddo Middle Career and Technology School. Some kind of way, I've joined the social studies curriculum team. They welcome me. I'm here. I help support.
We are elated to deliver content that is relevant and relatable to you and what you teach. For today's session, we will analyze Unit 1 from U.S. History, Industrialization and Expansion through the Progressive Era. Our session objectives today. First, explore Unit 1 and inquiry-based instruction. Describe and identify the unit claim. Use backwards design to assess the skills and knowledge needed to plan for assessments. And lastly, plan from an instructional task. Now let's look at what you need to be successful in today's session. Your scope and sequence, the companion document if you're in a tested area, your Caddo Parish scope and sequence guide, your notes catcher, and your unit task set planning template. Go ahead and pause the video to gather these items. Once you get them, come on back. All right, let's go. Let's look at our first objective again. Explore Unit 1 and inquiry-based instruction. Now, you might be thinking, what is inquiry-based instruction? By definition, it's a form of active learning that starts by posing questions, problems, or scenarios rather than only presenting established facts. Okay, so what does that mean? I'm sure you've noticed that each of your units begin with a claim that doesn't really sound like a claim. This was a struggle for me initially, as my professional reference to the term claim was an assertion or position, and I teach my students to create them and validate them with evidence. In social studies, however, through inquiry-based instruction, the units begin with an essential question for learners to grapple with throughout the unit. As they work to build content knowledge, they learn to develop claims based on that guiding question. You may be thinking, why inquiry-based instruction? Great question. Take a moment to read the social studies vision. I'm giving you a moment. Okay, so we want students to use sources regularly to learn content. We want them to make connections among people, events, and ideas across time and place, and express informed opinions supported by evidence from sources and content knowledge. Now let's look at how that ties into the goals of social studies. We have to set the context for students by giving them the necessary context for teaching new information. We want them to explore sources. They read and examine them to build that content knowledge. We want them to develop claims. They clarify their understanding and make connections using evidence. And then they express those claims through speaking or writing. Most often in social studies classrooms, we see set the context and exploring sources more than we see develop and express claims. Inquiry-based instruction is definitely going to help shift your thinking as you plan to deliver effective social studies instruction. And it will also extend students' thinking to allow them to manifest the social studies vision. Now, let's take a look at some important pieces you should already be familiar with. Your subject standards, and these are further broken down into your GLEs. Your scope and sequence, which is provided by the Louisiana Department of Education. Your companion document really underscores priority content. Your Caddo scope and sequence guides help you maneuver through your social studies scope and sequence. Now, it does not replace it, but it definitely helps you get through each unit. And lastly, you should be very familiar with assessing student work. Now, we're talking about taking a closer look at what students know and are able to do based on the standards or GLEs that you're teaching. Paula, take it away.
So let's start with Unit 1. I want you to begin by listing the steps that you take when you prepare to teach a lesson from the scope and sequence. Pause the video, take about 2 minutes to get this done, and when you have completed the task, resume. Okay, now that you've done that, I want you to take a look at those steps and really focus on the first one. What does that first step focus on? What we'd like it to ideally focus on is the end, and that's where we really take on this educational process known as backwards design. And in this process, there are 3 stages of planning. First, identify desired results. Second, determine acceptable evidence. And third, plan learning experiences and instruction. Let's go ahead and move on to the next objective, and that is to describe and identify the unit claim. When planning, if we're taking the approach for backwards design, we have the unit claim driving each of these steps. So first, we want to relate the task to that unit claim. That's going to be our driving purpose. Second, we want to post the unit claim for the duration of the unit where the students can see it. As they see it posted for the duration of the unit, they will better be able to make connections as they take in new content. Third, we want to use the framing page in the scope and sequence for the topic. This will help as we internalize the content and provide structure to what we are taking in. Fourth, we're going to choose supporting questions from the task in order to help as we build content knowledge and help those students better be able to express the claim's response. So when we look at the framing page, I want you to notice that this is something many of us did not know had a term. This is the beginning page in the scope and sequence where you have the units lined out. You have the claims are listed here easily, as well as a pacing guidance given to you by the state. On this page, you are going to see the names for each of those units. We're going to focus on this first one right here. Then you have U.S. history claims in this, and this will help you be able to have a quick reference. There's our claim. And then it gives you the estimated amount of time. This says August and September for the amount of time it would take to adequately cover the content. Additionally, after it covers each of the units, you have this navigation document. Each of these are hyperlinked and they will allow you to easily maneuver through the scope and sequence as you click on that. You will have an overview for each unit. You will have a set of instructions for the tasks themselves, as well as the documents that need to go along with it and any potential assessment at the end of the unit. The next objective is to use backwards design to assess the skills and knowledge needed to plan for assessments. Before we start, a helpful tip is to go to Louisiana Believes website. In the search bar, enter the term EAGLE. In the list, you'll find EAGLE 360, and it'll take you to different item sets that have been recently posted over the course of the year. Select U.S. History, and to access those questions, this is where you'll find the information that is included in this PD. Now, one of the questions that you're going to need to think about is how does instruction focused on claims, i.e. inquiry-based instruction, help students gain deeper content knowledge? We're going to go against this idea of just an instruction of teaching just facts and really making our content reflect these questions that follow. I want you to ask yourself, what knowledge must students have in order to master this assessment? And how does the item set reflect shifts? The use of sources, making connections, and developing informed opinions. Now, this item set focuses on Western expansion here in Unit 1. The first document you see is an excerpt from the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is, again, an act of legislation that students may find some challenging language. We want to make sure that if a document is referenced in the scope and sequence, that we have given them the proper exposure to that. The next document is the only one barred out, and this is a political cartoon. While there is context given, we want to make sure that our students have those skills on how to properly analyze a political cartoon, taking information and being able to make connections with what is depicted to what they know. Now, you additionally have in source 3 a map, and this is just simply titled Railroads. This is going to be important for students to feel comfortable analyzing. We want them to know that these maps can be used not just for geographic or directional information, but to give us historical information as well. Source 4 is a photograph. This Native American students at the Carlisle Indian School in 1880. We want students to know how to analyze that photo, be able to make sure that they can make connections to content that they're familiar with. And additionally, you see source 5. This is an excerpt from the Dawes Act. This one happens to provide definitions for those challenging terms. Next, you have source 6, and that is the extermination of bison to 1889. In this map, you do see multiple colors. You want to make sure that students know how to use those text features in order to best interpret the document that's before them. Additionally, you have multiple choice questions that are included here for you to be able to see. You want to make sure students pay attention to text features like bolded terms, what those verbs are in the questions, what lists are included, like listing of sources that they need to reference. You want to have them, whether it's one source or two. This one here uses 2 sources, and they can better move from one question to the next with ease. The next thing I want you to take a look at is this extended response question that's included in the item set. This says, based on the sources and your knowledge of U.S. history, analyze how westward expansion contributed to antagonism among ethnic groups within the United States. There are 2 very important points to make about that question. For the first part, based on the sources and your knowledge of U.S. history, this is a common phrasing. You might want to model your particular questions on your assessments to follow this format so that students are familiar and feel very confident that they know when they see this question that they know an extended response expectation follows. Additionally, you'll see the language mentioning antagonism among ethnic groups. This is going to come directly from one of the supporting questions in the task. If you want to find the answers to those questions, again, if you go ahead and access Eagle 360, you will find it at the end of the document that comes up. I want you to think about, as we looked at those item sets, how are the shifts reflected and what connections can you make between inquiry-based instruction, and this type of assessment? One of the most common questions we get in social studies is, how do I prepare my students for the test? Follow questions that usually come, or what do they need to know? What do I need to teach so I can just teach that? But unfortunately, that's not how this works. Success on the assessment is about building content knowledge, teaching it in multiple ways so that students better understand the content and they can effectively take on those questions. So if all that you see on the screen is what was posted in the classroom, and that's the list of content that teachers were asking for, you can see the students might struggle to fully answer the item sets that we just analyzed. Content is there, the antagonism of Western expansion, and we see that there are references of information that are relative, but truly what could they answer? If we are using an inquiry-based instructional approach, we want to use the unit claim to drive that instruction. How do innovation and expansion affect a nation's identity? Well, we're going to go to the scope and sequence and pull those supporting questions or other reference questions in order to better make connections. You'll see that we need to answer the question of what is American identity in order to fully answer that unit claim. Second, does the good of Western expansion outweigh the bad? Third, what examples of progress and conflict arose from Western expansion in the second half of the 19th century? And fourth, what instances of social, political, and economic antagonism between cultural and ethnic groups arose from Western expansion? If we are using these questions
to drive our instruction, this is going to have a change on the understanding that students have of Western expansion. And now we'll start to see the social studies vision at work. We'll see instruction start to reflect those shifts, because what we're going to need to do is to bring in sources to help students develop their own claims about the content and make those connections. The Western expansion content we're going to need to provide them is the push and pull factors, concepts like manifest destiny, the treaties and legislation that assisted expansion, the causes and effects of conflict between Native Americans and white settlers, as well as the ethnic and cultural groups' responses to the rising tensions and hostilities, and the effects of farming, railroads, and mining. As we start to do this, you're going to see that students are not just having questions asked. What we are doing is seeing the questions are posed in a way to push students to integrate the strands, to make connections to key themes, or even across curriculum. If that claim is how do innovation and expansion affect the nation's identity, you're going to have them pull for social, political, economic antagonism, economic changes on the Western frontier, and what the national response is to Western expansion.
Okay, we're down to our final objective in today's session. Plan from an instructional task. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where it gets good.
Okay, so now let's talk about the things that we need for planning, okay? All right.
Okay, so as we sit down to start planning, and we're doing this with our backwards design approach, we are going to actually put our plan on the Canvas page. In addition, we're going to start, of course, with the scope and sequence, where everything's divided up with the instructional tasks and objectives. We need the companion document to get that clarification if we have any questions. And in addition, we have the scope and sequence guide put out. You can find this on Canvas page. So as we start with this, we want to dive into the curriculum and begin with the claims and the instructional tasks. With Unit 1, this is going to start with Western expansion, and we will take our claim, how do innovation and expansion affect the nation's identity, and put that down on the template on this first line. And then we will dive into the task and find those questions that help support the inquiry approach, as well as those questions that help you clarify and produce the deliverables.
All right, Paula, so let's start with our planning sequence.
Okay, so with that, you want to turn to your scope and sequence, and when you get to the first unit, you will find the page that gives you the framework. And this is going to have the unit assessment, which really has the claim there. For this one, it's how do innovation and expansion affect the nation's identity?
All right, so that means on my template where it says unit claim, I'll just be writing that question.
That's exactly where you'll write it. Then you will move on and read through the steps that are put there for you in the task. And this is where you will find your task question for inquiry and the supporting questions throughout. And they will be offset with quotation marks so you can easily identify.
So I'm not having to make them up, they're right here.
They are right here in the plan.
All right, so then I add it here, the supporting questions.
Exactly.
Awesome.
All right, in addition to that, you will see in that first block for assessments. And those assessments are also suggested here. Of course, you can modify this to your own classroom. You will know your learners, but that's where you can start.
All right. Now, step 3 says to explore the claims and assessments.
Okay.
All right.
In doing that, you're going to find what documents are brought into the instructional task.
Okay.
Many of these are hyperlinked if you're working on it, but they are printed and available if you are working with a printed copy like we have. And you would place that on the template under source, identify what evidence needs to be done and your strategies that you're going to take with your learners in order to do it. In addition, what context you might need to provide for those kids to master it.
Yeah. Okay. Now, step 4 tells us to set the context and build background knowledge.
So, of course, if we're doing backwards design in our plan, we are going to have to set the background information for the kids in order to then get them to analyze. So they need to know information before they can analyze it. So we will plan out what we need to provide for them, the way that we're going to do this, and of course we can address our different learners and their learning styles as we plan.
All right, this definitely speaks to teacher content knowledge, and my biggest takeaway right now is you cannot wing a social studies lesson.
You cannot. No.
In planning for an instructional task, we know that planning is a process. Take a look at the blue arrow here. Set the vision of mastery, explore claims, explore assessments, create opportunities to dive into content, explore sources, set the context, and build background knowledge. Now think about backwards design planning. Remember, you just learned that means to begin with the end in mind. So consider how the planning process correlates to the steps in the instructional tasks below. Pause the video for about 1 minute to connect each piece. Okay, let's see how you did. Did you say express claims is directly tied to the first couple of steps in the planning process? If you did, awesome job. Don't forget, backwards design planning says to begin with the end in mind. If we know that we want students to express claims, that means we have to start there in the planning process so we can create those opportunities to build them. Let's continue. Each part of the process in planning for an instructional task directly relates to a part of the vision for social studies instruction. Planning for an instructional task follows the principles of backward design. We must consider those look-fors in each lesson. Remember, Paula discussed the importance of anticipating student responses. Doing so helps you to monitor and adjust your instruction. You know what you should hear learners say as they're engaging in discussion, as well as when they're expressing their understanding through writing. This also means you have considered how they will express their claims. After you've given thought to the assessments, it's time to start planning the steps to get them there. Paula will model what this looks and sounds like for you. The planning activity, you're going to access Unit 1, Topic 1, Task 1 from the grade you teach. We'll break down the process step by step, giving you planning time in between.
Okay, so let's practice actually using the companion documents with the scope and sequence. You'll need to get the most recent copy of the U.S. History Companion document. If you had printed this out at the beginning of last year, you can go ahead and get the most recently updated one that was posted during the school year. So first, you want to find the unit in the companion document that corresponds with the unit that you're planning. For this one, it's Unit 1. You'll make note of the unit title, the topics within that unit. This one's going to be focusing on Topic 1, Westward Expansion. That's why it's highlighted. You'll see the key connections. Some of these are focused in just the area of social studies. Sometimes they make those connections to other areas. You have your GLEs listed here and numbered. And then you have the priority content and concepts listed here. For Unit 1, you're going to see the majority of these are highlighted. You'll want to make sure that you take the time to highlight each of them, making note of the verbiage. This verbiage is oftentimes something that the students will see on assessments in the future. Now, for the planning of this particular unit, you'll notice that I've put 2 pink X's through the areas under the essential content that do not apply to this particular instructional task. Although it's part of the unit, it will not apply to the content that we're covering. Additionally, I go to the end of that unit corresponding material, and you will find ancillary content. This one corresponds with the historical thinking skill, US 1.1, and I've highlighted the one that's the most relevant. Analyze a variety of primary sources written by Native Americans from different tribes to explain common and divergent experiences. This is going to be very helpful in addressing those objectives. Okay, so then next what you'll want to do is refer to the scope and sequence, pulling out that instructional task. As you go through the full instructional task, you're going to make note of the prioritized content. For this, you'll see that I've made some annotations regarding the questions that need to be asked, the different suggested assessments, and then questions that the students will use within activities. I've also made note of important documents that either link outside or they do provide you with additional supplementary links for those documents below on the page. After you've gone through and you've annotated looking for this information, what you're doing is you are sifting through to see the areas that you either need to cut or those areas that you need to prioritize and actually supplement with additional information. After you've figured out what you need to do, you need to make sure that you keep pacing in mind, as well as remembering that you know your learners best and you'll know what information to provide them. So when using the companion documents with the scope and sequence, what you're going to need to remember is to review the companion document for that unit. Again, it helps guide that instruction. Review an instructional task from the scope and sequence. Make sure to cross-check to see if all content from the companion document on that topic is covered. If it is not, then you'll need to make sure that you find additional resources. Make notes on what to cut and what to supplement, if there's any need for that at all. And if needed, determine how you're going to supplement it. Will you supplement with additional instruction in whole group instruction? Will you provide videos? Whatever means you need to use in order to best suit your learners. As we continue to plan with a backwards design focus, we want to make sure that our information is as structured as possible. What you see before you is the unit task set plan sheet, as well as the steps listed out beside each component on it. So let's begin. Step 1 is to use the scope and sequence to identify the grade, unit, topic, and task set. For this information, you are going to turn to the scope and sequence and find this information at the beginning of the unit. I'm going to pause the video for 2 minutes so you can complete the step. Now that you've had a chance to look for that information, for this unit, Unit 1, you'll find the information listed is for Grade 11, Unit 1, topic is Western expansion, and the task is antagonism of Western expansion. Now, we'll move on to the next step. Step 1B is to identify the unit claim and unit assessment. This information will go here in this box, unit claim, and the assessment corresponding out to the right. You'll find this again at the beginning, as well as the suggestion of how the state says that you can assess that information. Go ahead and pause again for another 2 minutes to complete this step. After reading, we will find that the unit claim is how do innovation and expansion affect a nation's identity. The state suggested to assess this, you can use an essay. Step 1C is to identify task questions for inquiry and assessment. If we're focusing with inquiry-based instruction, we'll need to scan through that instructional task looking for those suggested or supporting questions. Go ahead and pause the video for 5 minutes as you read through the instructional task, make the necessary annotations, and transfer it to this sheet. Okay, now that you've found the information, it says, does the good of westward expansion outweigh the bad? And for this assessment, they suggest a class discussion. Of course, you can use those discussion trackers to assist in that assessment. The next part we're going to take a look at is filling out the rest of this box. And this is where they call step 2. We're going to create supporting questions and identify unit activities and unit assessments. Many times in those instructional tasks, you will be able to find them specifically listed as supporting question 1, supporting question 2, and easily identify the assessment that goes along with it. As you read through, go ahead and give yourself 5 minutes to pause and complete this step. For this unit, you're going to see this instructional task only has 2 separately identified supporting questions. Supporting question 1 is what examples of progress and conflict arose from westward expansion in the second half of the 19th century. The assessment for that is a paragraph. The next question is, what instances of social, political, and economic antagonism between cultural and ethnic groups arose from westward expansion? And for that, they want to go ahead and push it a step further with an extended paragraph. Moving on to the next step, this part is going to take a little bit longer. For step 3, you're going to read and dissect the sources for key evidence, strategies, and context of the sources. These sources are those that are specifically listed within the instructional task, provided with a hyperlink that takes you outside of the document, or with those supplemental links, you can plug those into your browser. Pause the video for 10 minutes to complete this step. As you plug in the information, you can make sure to make note of the source title, the evidence that goes along, suggested reading strategy, and the context necessary to best understand that source. This particular instructional task has a number of sources to refer to. As a cohesive title, I've put SAS reading for scope and sequence reading, and listing specifically the first one as Homestead Act and the Exodusters. The next one listed is the SAS reading for the Dawes Act. Now for this first unit, or first document, you are going to need to have the key evidence of the Homestead, and what is an exoduster, Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the Ku Klux Klan, and migration, making sure the students understand all of that information and can pull that from the document as they read. The reading strategy suggested within the instructional task is to read independently and answer questions within a small group context. Now, context for best understanding the document, you'll see that there are references to the Gold Rush, Civil War, Reconstruction, the Louisiana Purchase, Oregon Trail, Mexican War, and additional challenging information that maybe is dependent upon the learners that are in your class. As we plan, you'll need to ask what information will the sources provide to help students make and support their claim. First, they need to read each source carefully, making note that the evidence the students could use to support a claim. Next, you're going to determine the best strategy the students will use. Next, you'll provide context background knowledge for complex concepts. As you have taken the time to go through and look for the necessary context to present, you'll know what you need to go ahead and add to your instruction. And lastly, you're going to determine how students will access those sources. And now we're going to continue moving on through that unit task set plan sheet. For step 4, you're going to have to put what information needs to be supplemented, the strategies for teaching that content, as well as the key vocabulary that is needed in order to best understand that. For this unit, I've gone ahead and made a note for the scope and sequence reading with the links, put that in there. The others I put together in a more collective notation using that same approach. Again, read independently the group questions that are listed. And for step 4, the key content to review before engaging in a task, if I'm going to ask the students to address the nation's identity, I need them to understand what is the meaning of American identity. In order to set the stage for the new information, we'll need to recall the information that they learned in their 7th grade U.S. history class. And the methods for teaching the review content can go in multiple ways. Within the instructional task, there was a suggestion for a 1-minute quick write, a paragraph where they are going to write the information that they can recall. And again, we can use the other strategies like our unwrap bell ringers in order to review that content that they have previously learned. Now, the instructions here said that we need to put those key terms that we need to introduce. Words like antagonism, references to primary and secondary sources, the factors that lead to westward expansion. Some of those words can be challenging or just need a little bit of elaboration so students know how it is applied in the social studies classroom. Additionally, we'll need to know how we're going to introduce those terms. This can be done through Nearpod, guided questions, or even just whole group instruction. Now that we've completed the sheet, we need to think about what context do you need to provide so that the students can engage with the source. First, you need to determine how you will deliver the content to engage the students most effectively and efficiently. Next, you need to set up the source so students can get the key points from that source. You want to make sure that students have the opportunity to truly engage with that source themselves. Again, you'll want to determine the pacing and break the task into daily lessons to meet the students' needs, making sure that if you need to make adjustments in those instructional days and best suit your students' needs dependent on the school activities. And lastly, you're going to need to plan intros and closings to include with those daily lessons. You'll want to break up the activities to keep the students engaged and make sure that it can be taught again within the limitations of our class period. And as we wrap up, it's always great to have those useful instructional planning hints. First, you want to divide an instructional task into class periods. If you are using backwards design, you'll know the emphasis for that unit as it relates to the number of school days that you have in front of you, and you can allot those school days accordingly. You will need to adapt the task to make it work for your students, so do change the reading strategy to better fit those students' needs. Do exert a longer source where necessary if you can get the same impact with a shorter text source rather than the entirety of a document. Go ahead and do that for your learners. Do supplement a source with a textbook source if it is high quality and more readable for the students. Again, remembering that challenging language is something that we can pick up on with our students as we get to know them at the beginning of the year. You'll want to avoid omitting a source altogether. All of those sources that are referenced within the scope and sequence are often very testable and highly likely to be seen again by the students. You'll definitely want to use that companion document with the scope of your planning to make sure that you are familiar with the language as well as your students. And for your next steps, you'll want to continue this process. Make sure that you attend the upcoming trainings that are available to you and check the Social Studies Canvas page for those updates. They will be provided and updated frequently throughout the school year.